Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming out on this gorgeous day in October. October in Kentucky is gorgeous, beautiful, isn't it? There's a certain melancholy, I think, today, but if we think like poets, there's also an equal balance of joy. And I have prepared comments, and I may read from them, because today's an emotional day for all of us here at EKU Libraries as we honor our friend, Charles Bracelen Flood. A warm welcome to our very special guest, the Flood family, who traveled from the far reaches of the United States. Raise your hand for Texas, Connecticut, over there, boys, little boys, Connecticut, and all the way from Berkeley, California, sweet Lucy. A special welcome to my predecessors, friends, and mentors, Lee Van Orsdel and Carrie Cooper, who are going to speak to you a little bit later. Certainly friends of mine, and Mr. Flood loved and admired them too. I say that I inherited Bracelen from the two of them here in the library. I want to point out Carol Thomas. She's standing back there in the back. She was an able assistant to Bracelen here, and fondly we remember her today because Bracelen could be high maintenance. And I will note, for those of you who think that was an unfair statement, that his family laughed the loudest. Thank you for coming today as we honor our great friend, noted author, community activist, and proud Harvard man. I see a maroon in the audience, but today I wore closest to crimson that I could for Harvard. Though many of us in the libraries attended his funeral, we felt we needed to honor his passing in our own way, and we are so grateful that you wanted to share this time with us. Today marks the opening day of Keeneland. We know that, right? Everybody's going to probably leave for Keeneland. It'll be a wet and messy day, but in Kentucky, we know that sometimes that's how it is. Also, today marks the beginning of American Archives Month. So this is an important month for libraries, museums, and archives, and certainly for Bracelen. I think Lucy may talk about that a little bit later. But when I think of archives and research and Keeneland, certainly Bracelen's image is in my mind. So before we begin honoring him today, I would like to thank a few people, because this is a dedication of this space that you're sitting in. A few people in the library who worked tirelessly in this renovation. You may not know, many of you, that this space used to be full of shelves of bound volumes of periodicals and journals. How many of you research? How many of you are researchers? I know this crowd. Look at you all. Look at the hands going up there. So because of several large destructive mold outbreaks down here, we had to relocate all of those journals to an upper floor. Some of you may remember that. I think of it like this, and this is how Bracelen would think of it. You can imagine how many ideas that we saved, how many educated opinions, how much research, how many ideas for inspiration, free for the taking. That's how he would think of it. He wouldn't think of it that we moved some volumes upstairs. It would be way more edifying than that. He never thought that what we did here was mundane. He thought it was significant. And we are just so humbled by that he thought of us that way. He would think of this renovation in that way. He acknowledged the values of libraries in free and democratic societies. So nothing that we did was ordinary, nothing. He believed in the role of libraries as keepers of ideas and protectors of freedom of access to those ideas. That made us feel very important, didn't it, guys? Yes. Specifically, I would like to thank Julie George. Julie, will you stand up? And Jeremy Turner, who may or may not be at the delivery of his baby right now. We're not sure. But they were key in developing the concept for this space and coordinating the logistics. It was no easy task. Beverly Heisel, who's not here today, who shared a very special friendship with Mr. Flood. She worked in the trenches deconstructing and reconstructing the space, yelling at us the whole entire time, but she did it with joy. Penny Centers, who lorded over us with the budget, telling us what we couldn't buy anymore of. Krista Rodas, sweet Krista. Krista, where are you? She's in the back, like Krista so humbly does. Kept our Friends of the Libraries in the loop, and welcome to our Friends of the Libraries. You guys are absolutely magnificent. kept the friends in the library in the loop as to how the space was developing. A very special student, Bailey Cox, who was a student senator and sat with us as we planned this space. We definitely wanted his student perspective. And Jana Weiss, I'm not sure Provost Weiss could be here this morning, but she believed enough in this idea that she did put forward quite a bit of funding to help us get to where we are today in this space. And to President Benson, who recognized early on that this vast, cavernous space could be made into an inviting place where we could encourage our students to succeed. And I have to tell you a story that when he walked down here, the carpet had been here for over 20 years, and it was kind of wrinkly, like a Shar-Pei's fur, a Shar-Pei dog, and he immediately recognized that that probably had to go first, and that really inspired us to start the entire renovation that you see here. I am honored, and I really am honored, to introduce our slate of speakers today. You all will just follow each other in succession to the podium, if that's okay, because we got started just a little bit late. Lee Van Orsdel, Dean of Libraries at Grand Valley State in Grand Valley, Michigan. Carrie Cooper, Dean of Libraries, College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Mr. Flood's daughter, Lucy, from Berkeley, California. And finally, our president, Dr. Michael Benson, who will read from Bracelen's last book, First to Fly. So you want to start, Lee?
I came to EKU in 1999, and when I got here, I heard almost immediately about this writer guy that hung around the library and would write books, and was from Harvard, and all I could think about, what's a guy from Harvard doing at EKU? No offense to EKU, but that just doesn't normally follow. And so it took me a while to figure out who this dude really was, and why he used our library, and how special a relationship the library had with him already. And the more I got to know him, the more I came to see his talent, his genius for writing compelling history, and how much he added to our community in the library and to our sense of who we were in the eyes of an accomplished scholar. So when Betina asked me to say a few words about Bracelen, I said yes immediately. And then I realized how very difficult it is to distill the essence of a rich and lengthy relationship into a few words, and how hard it is to talk in superlatives about someone you admire without sounding like some kind of groupie. So ultimately, I decided to talk about the things I loved about being Bracelen's friend. These are the things I would say to him today if I could. These are the things I believe he would want most to hear from someone who treasured his friendship and recognized his gifts. First, I love his books. I've read all but one of the nonfiction books, and I can't wait to get my hands on the new one. My husband has done the same. I've recommended them to friends. I've loaned them out to others. I've read reviews of them just for the fun of it. I've seen them displayed in bookstores and at exhibits at the American Library Association all around the country. Bracelen wrote nonfiction with flair and style and with scholarly acuity. Like few other historians, he picked you up on the first page, and he didn't let you go until the end of the story. So the first book he gave me was Lee's Final Years. Okay, Robert E. Lee. Can you tell I'm from Alabama? That suited me just fine. I could understand why anyone would want to write about Robert E. Lee. And then a few years, he was really grappling with what he was going to write about next, and he kept coming up with Sherman and Grant. Well, being from the South, Mr. Sherman is not particularly well respected where I come from. And Grant, we just thought of him as a drunken president. We had been more or less socialized. Actually, it's, you all are almost Southerners here, but it wasn't as bad as Lincoln. I was taught to love and adore and value Lincoln, but Grant and Sherman, not so much. So I wonder why in the world anybody would want to study these two kind of, compromised beings. But I read the book, and I loved it. I didn't love the men so much. I like Grant better than Sherman, but I did see a very persuasive argument. So he began to kind of change my idea about the Great War we don't speak of too often. But then he came out with Grant's Final Victory. I fell in love with Ulysses S. Grant at the hands of Bracelen's writing for both my husband and myself. That book not only changed our understanding of history and of one man's character, but it also was one of the most beautiful and moving books I've ever read. I wept through it. It's my favorite of all of Bracelen's books that I've read, and one of my favorite books of all time. If you haven't read it, get a copy. So the second thing I loved about Bracelen was arguing with him. And man, did we argue. We sparred over everything, from campus politics to national politics to global politics, and all things history related and how they might be interpreted. I always took comfort in knowing that Lucy and I shared an enjoyment of taking a liberal position and then seeing how far we could budge him from where he was. Nudging him ever to the left, maybe an inch in 8 years. Probably not much more. But it was fun to have a conspiracy. And third, it was a privilege to be present when Bracelen was trying to develop an idea for a new book. He went through all kinds of ideas, and he'd come in my office and we'd spar about those too. They were all Yankees, but it was still interesting. It was amazing to watch the process of trying on an idea, doing some research about it, then talking about how he might approach it, ultimately discarding it, as a whole series of possible topics got discarded before settling on the Grant-Sherman friendship, which was the one I got to be listening in on a little bit. I loved hearing about his agent shopping the manuscript around. I loved when he got the call that said he was gotten a really nice deal. Never told me what it was, but I gathered it was very pleasing. And then to see it come into print and garner great reviews and other accolades was just very, very satisfying. I felt very privileged to be watching that kind of a process unfold. And then the last thing I would want Bracelen to know is that I was honored to be his friend and colleague. He had a great mind. He had a great heart. And he had a great sense of humor. I wasn't wild about his politics. I liked the other stuff. His talent was immense, yet he welcomed many of us into his journeys as a scholar. He appreciated EKU Libraries. I'll never forget the time he returned from Harvard. He went up there to accept an award, and he came back and told me very proudly that he cornered some librarian up there and told them that their library, in essence, kind of sucked, and they really needed to be more like EKU. That was a sweet moment. Whoever that was, they're probably thinking to this day, where the heck is EKU? What is that? Anyway, it was funny. So to Bracelen, in spirit, your books will always be on my bookshelf. Your ideas will always live in my mind. The memory of your friendship will delight me to the end of my days. And for all of us who got to know you here in the library, you will have a very special place in our hearts for all time to come. To Bracelen.
It is such an honor to follow Lee Van Orsdel as Dean of Libraries here, and thank you, Betina, for letting me be part of today. Bracelen Flood was my friend, and friends believe in you when you lack self-confidence. You got it, Cooper. They cheer you on and tell you that you can conquer the world. That's what Bracelen did for me. He made me feel invincible at times in my life when I needed him most. For the first few years I worked at EKU Libraries, I didn't have a reason to cross paths with Bracelen. As I moved into new positions and had more responsibility for departments and people, I became more aware of Bracelen and the impact he was having on this organization. He relied heavily on the reference librarians and interlibrary loan and Carroll Thomas and government documents for his research needs. However, it was the camaraderie he found with the students and staff in circulation that kept him youthful, laughing, and wholly satisfied with his work environment here. Pretty near the first day I was named interim dean of libraries here, following Lee's departure, Bracelen came to visit and to express his support. He wrote a letter to President Glasser in the time leading up to the national search for the permanent dean. During this time, the concept for the Studio for Academic Creativity was taking shape, and it was clear to me that to accomplish our goals, we would need to aggressively pursue private support. Bracelen fit nicely into our plan to resurrect a library board and to get the broader Richmond community involved. He wholeheartedly agreed to be the president of the Friends of the Library, and he knew just which of his friends, and a lot of them are here today,
to call upon for the task at hand. One by one, he called them and invited them to join the board and support Eastern's library. I couldn't have asked for a more supportive and articulate board president. Because he knew us so well and had been writing books for years from within the Crabbe Library, the stories would flow. He compared us to Harvard and bragged from the perspective of a talented writer and experienced researcher, and we were honored and downright thrilled that he thought so highly of us. It was validating on so many levels. All of the people in this library who had the pleasure of knowing him, whether it was helping him hunt down information for his latest book project, or listening to boyhood stories over chicken salad and fried bologna sandwiches, savored the moments. He is a treasured figure in this library's past. His relationship with the leaders of this library have been a major factor in the success here. It's the most creative and nurturing environment I've ever had the pleasure to be part of. There is no way that two young female internal candidates ready to take on their first experience leading a library would have been permitted to do so without Bracelen Flood. He was reassuring us on the home front and bragging about us when it counted at the highest level, and I'm full of gratitude for all that he did for me and for this library. After I left Eastern and began working at William and Mary, it was a surreal moment to invite Bracelen and Kathy to my new home in Williamsburg and to host an event at Swem Library for his book Grant's Final Victory, the one that Lee spoke about. He was so proud and happy to see me thriving in a new home. Again, he was gently pushing me ahead. He was beginning the research for his final book that we are celebrating here today. It's always a joy to be back at Eastern Kentucky University, and it's especially meaningful to be celebrating Bracelen and honoring him here today with all of you. Thank you.
Hello. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you what I know about my father's research process with respect to First to Fly. I'll also have this on hand, as it is also an emotional day for me. Before I get started, I want to thank the Dean of the Library, Betina Gardner, as well as Krista Rodas, the Director of Library Advancement. Both of them did so much to make today possible, and they were both also close friends of my father's. I also want to thank Carrie Cooper and Lee Van Orsdel for coming all the way back here. And you made my father's time here both rewarding and successful. And as you know, he took great interest in your careers going forward. Another shout out to Carol Thomas, who assisted my father with so many things that made this book possible. And finally, I'd like to thank President Benson, who's done so much to honor him in the past year. What I'll share with you today comes from my own experience of helping my father with his research for First to Fly, as well as from conversations I had with Kevin Jones, Amber Smith, and Cindy Traynor Bleiberg, all of whom helped him with the book. It's a true pleasure to be here. I got to help my father with many of his books. He would start asking Curtis Caperton and I for feedback on his books once we turned about 12 years old. But more than with any other book, I got to help him with the research, the writing, and the editing of First to Fly. So let me start at the beginning. The first time that I became aware of my father's interest in the Lafayette Escadrille was when we were en route to Costa Rica for a 10-day vacation. As we waited in front of our gate for our airplane to arrive, my father looked up from a book that he was reading, removed his glasses, and explained that the American pilots whom he was reading about had a couple of pet lions as mascots. Their names were Whiskey and Soda. He had that joyful grin on his face that many of you can recall so well. Then he turned the book around and showed me the photos, and he read me a gripping passage about these lions. Seeing his sheer enthusiasm made me guess that he had found his next book subject matter, and indeed he had. Over the course of the following 10 days, while my family and I ran around chasing waves and turtles, my father, with every bit as much enthusiasm, set up his desk on the dining room table in the middle of the rental house where we were staying, and he managed to devour a half a dozen or more books on these men, taking careful notes as he went along. Occasionally, he made his way out to the rudimentary thatch-roofed hut bar that was sort of the social center of the place where we were staying. And he drank down a mango smoothie, charmed a few people, and went for a swim. I see that many of you know about the charm factor. I think my nephews have inherited that. After socializing for a while, he would inevitably go back and delve deeper into the story of the Lafayette Escadrille. When he got back to Kentucky, he returned to EKU's Crabb Library, this very building, where, as many of you know, he had a desk and an office where he worked nearly every day, and that's where he set to work, learning as much as he could about these pilots. Soon he narrowed in on about 20 people whose stories particularly captivated him. It was the daredevil pilots, the civilians that supported them, and the lions that caught his imagination. One thing that made his research process particularly effective was that he collaborated with librarians, translators, and other historians. He felt that for its size and mission, EKU's Crabb Library was one of the best research libraries in the world, and having an office in the library made collaborations with research librarians particularly easy. Seeking out the assistance of those who could help him with his research was something he began as a young man. I found letters between him and his mother dating back to the early 50s when he was writing Love is a Bridge, where he would write her from Harvard, where he was in law school, asking her to track down certain dates and facts relating to Manhattan in the late 1920s. This book would become a New York Times bestseller by the time he was 23. So even from a young age, he was meticulous about getting his stories right, making sure that every fact and detail was as accurate as possible. And he relied on other people to help him do this. In the case of First to Fly, my father came to Amber Smith, a Richmond resident and a former UCLA law school librarian, with a list of 20 people of interest, and she set to work looking in the New York Times for information about them, which was quite ample. The novelty of flight, the prestigious background of many of the pilots, not to mention their death-defying antics, made them a prominent target of journalism in those days. My father would look through lists of books related to the flyers, and then their footnotes would take him to new research materials. At this stage, interlibrary loan was critical. He would find a source located at another library, and Pat New would track it down. Pat New helped him a great deal. Then they would call librarians at other libraries, and pretty soon, people all over the country were trying to help him get the materials he needed to complete the research to tell the story. As I mentioned, my father was meticulous in his research process. Amber helped him translate Captain Thanal's Book of Operations, a book where he kept notes that included lists of planes that flew each day and where they went and what their mission was. In order to do justice in conveying their stories, he had to fully grasp the nuances of their daily life. But he also respected other people's opinions. He wanted to know what his friends and colleagues thought was interesting or fascinating about this group of people. Dwight Taylor, who was his former resident assistant from his days at Harvard, and who was in his mid-90s, would send my father nearly every week a new letter that would arrive on yellow legal paper. It would arrive from San Francisco, and he would share his take on the book and where he thought it should go next. And my father let these comments sink in, and he came to his own terms with the seeds that had been planted by Dwight and others. So he didn't go into writing this book with a fixed notion of what it would be. Only until he went through all of the material did he start discovering the story that he would tell. His gift was taking vast amount of material, reading it, coming to understand that material so well that he could then explain it to an educated reader in such a way that they could understand how the lines of a battlefield moved and why or who the key players were and what motivated them. Like many of his other books, with this book, my father traveled to other places to do his research. He went to the UVA archives where they had James McConnell's papers. And he also went to Washington and Lee, where he had done a lot of research on his Lee the Last Years book. They were particularly helpful to him there. In fact, they let him spend the night in Lee's house when he was doing research on the Lee book, something I'm not sure they ever allowed anyone else to do. And they helped him on this book, find the papers of Kiffin Rockwell. But going to Paris was the big trip. Before we went, I assumed that we were going to be underground, looking in documents in poorly lit rooms, and that our translator would help us understand them. That could not have been farther from the truth. Soon after we arrived in Paris, my father informed me that we were there to experience the country. We were there to see how the bread smelled and tasted, to recall what shade of blue the sky was, and to hear the lilt of the French language. These kinds of details that he only could find through being there were what made his book so rich and distinctive from other historians' works. Many people said that he made history easy and enjoyable to read, and I think that's because he brought a novelist's eye for detail and for story to bear on writing history. Our trip to France was meant to bring the country to life for him, so that he could bring that country and its history to life for his reading audience. Another thing that surprised me about our trip was that we actually had a huge entourage. This is Maxime de Toussaint. He was a 24-year-old translator who was hoping to enter the French military. He was with us almost everywhere we went on our trip. And this is my father's friend Martin Omachi, who he'd met during his days in Tokyo in the 1960s. When he heard we were going to Paris, he decided to plan his own business trip to Paris so that he could hang out with us as well. This is Edouard Emmett, an artist who my father had known from his days in Manhattan as a young boy and also at Manhattan. This is in his studio in Paris, and he's a member of the Lafayette Escadrille Society and gave us some rare books on the Lafayette Escadrille that my father had never even heard of. He's wearing a Lafayette Escadrille tie in this photo that he then gave to my father. So he was a key member of our team. We also had my dad's agent's best friend, who was my age, there with us, and others who were along for the ride. Meeting Madame Brocard, General Antonine Brocard's daughter, was one of the highlights of the trip. We went out to dinner with her, and she was able to share with my father her recollections of her own father and of some of the other military people whom she had met. Having that firsthand connection to General Brocard was important for him. These types of accounts made these men that much more real for him. Going to the Memorial Day celebration at the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial on the outskirts of Paris was also an important moment. 46 American pilots are buried there. The memorial is modeled on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and it is half its size. A cadre of French and American military were on hand that day. 2 military planes flew over the ceremony partway through. This is the insignia of the Lafayette Escadrille, which was on their planes, but it was also on the memorial. Meeting the military personnel was stimulating for my father. But I believe that going down below and being with the crypts of the men who he was writing about was the most meaningful part. This is the crypt of Raoul Lufberry, one of the men he wrote the most about. I remember that he walked up to the crypt, put his hand on it, and said, "Good old Luff." It was almost like watching him meet Lufberry, and it was incredibly touching to see how much he cared about him and the other pilots. He had been living and breathing them for more than 1.5 years by this point, and he felt like he knew them. What I saw that day was his deeply human and personal connection to the men about whom he was writing. It was his passion for them and their stories that made his writing come to life for his readers. And here he is looking at the names on different crypts. My father had a unique way of taking advantage of every opportunity that came his way, whether it was in his professional or his extracurricular life, and many times the two overlapped. That was certainly true in Paris. And even though we were primarily there to do research for his book, he was also interested in showing me and his friends the Paris that he had known there during the 1950s. Taking me to the Ritz bar where he had met Hemingway in his 20s. Hemingway had actually told him that he had a copy of Love is a Bridge on his nightstand in Cuba, which was something that a 25-year-old author was quite pleased to hear. This is at the restaurant beside that bar. We also went to the Closerie des Lilas, a restaurant where Proust, Thomas Mann, James Joyce, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Henry Miller had all spent time. And here's a moment many of you will appreciate. My father loved chocolate. He surprised me by taking me on a boat trip down the Seine, and he has a huge grin on his face because he managed to pull off the surprise. So this is us on the riverboat. And as well as he had planned the trip, having me along also provided some unexpected surprises for both of us. His final day there, my boyfriend Carrie arrived. We had an hour-long layover together in the airport before my father would depart. Just as he was boarding the plane, unbeknownst to me, Carrie apparently rushed forward beside my father and asked him for my hand in marriage. This pretty much topped off what couldn't have been a more idyllic 10 days in Paris. For my part, I know that I probably wouldn't have ended up on a romantic island off of France for my engagement, so I'm quite grateful on a personal note for the trip. And it was also an incredibly fruitful research trip for my father. After returning from Paris, he had pretty much had all the details he needed to finish the book, and he was able to finish the book with a lot of speed and grace, which is wonderful. So up until now, I've spoken to you mostly about his research process, but I want to add that this library environment provided him with much more than a place to do research. This is a place that had a profound impact on his life. First of all, he found it an incredibly stimulating place to be. I can recall that on one of our last trips to the library, we were wandering around the periodical section upstairs, and he was just pointing to the vast amounts of information that this library holds, and to how proud he was of the library, and to the art on the wall, and to how lucky the kids in the building were that they were being exposed to this kind of literature and art at such a young age. And even as impressive as the facility and the resources are, just as important were the friendships he made with people who were working on his research and spending their time in the library. Some of his closest friendships and some of the people he admired most were people who worked within the walls of this building. This is an amazingly vibrant place to be and work. I've spent many days here myself. Every day when he came in here, his colleagues, the librarians, the students, the Java City employees challenged him to think in new ways about the things that interested him and mattered to him. Being around so many young people was clearly fun for him. I remember him telling me one day, "You know, Lucy, we no longer talk about how things are chic. We talk about how they're in." And I said, "Well, that's true. Where did you learn that, Dad?" And he said, "Oh, Leah Banks at the front desk. We were talking about fashion." He had conversations about fashion, politics, people's children that allowed him to bring more energy back to his desk. These people meant a lot to him. One year we had an extra Christmas party so that he could invite home so many friends from the library. I even remember his last Christmas in Berkeley with me. He was emailing Betina about her own father on Christmas morning. And it's clear to me that others benefited just as much from him as with him being here. Kevin Jones also told me that he misses the debates that he had with my father because my father did not use any talking points from the TV. Amber expressed her sadness of not getting to find out what the next project was going to be. The intellectual rigor of working with my father was enthralling. Cindy Traynor Blyberg shares how the most fun part of working on the photos with him was getting to hear the stories about each pilot relating to each photo. I remember I came in here last winter, and the woman behind the counter at Java City told me that she kept a photo of him in there and that he had given her money for her wedding bouquet. One of my friends says that people tend to thrive when they are in ecosystems or communities where they have mentors, peers, and people they are mentoring. EKU Libraries provided that for my father. Being here was incredibly beneficial for him and for his career. Not many can say that their career got a third wind in their 70s and 80s. My father sold 4 books in a decade. He went on countless book tours. As I look around at this new space that you are building here, or that you have built, I can't help but hope that this will be a place where people will solve major problems and create breakthroughs in intellectual domains. But I hope that it will also be a place where people will form the kinds of friendships and working relationships that will transform their lives and the lives of others for the better, as was the case for my father. I feel that he would be incredibly pleased to know that this space is being dedicated to him. And so I'll leave you with a question. What are the communities or the places where you feel the most creative, inspired, and effective? And what are you doing to make those places even more dynamic, worthwhile, and enriching places to be? Thank you so much. It was very meaningful to get to think about my father's research process, and I'm a better writer and researcher for having spent time writing this. Thank you. I forgot that I have one thing to add. Tonight they're dedicating the film Nerve to my father. It's at 7 at EKU Center for the Arts, and he'll be in a lot of the clips. It captures his efforts on the chemical weapons issue. Thank you.
Well, it's a real honor for me to be here today. And as I walked in, my friend Betina Gardner noted that I had a wardrobe malfunction. As I got out of my car, I split the seam on my jacket, so I got to quit working out apparently, Betina. I want to say to those who have been on the program already, to Lee and to Carrie, and also to Betina, they represent the kind of triumvirate of deans here. I have enormous respect for people who work in libraries. I've had the good fortune throughout my academic career as a historian, not nearly as good a historian as Bracelen, but to work in some of the world's great libraries, whether it was the Bodleian or the Harry Truman Library or the Library of Congress or the British Library, the archives there at Kew Gardens. And there's something very special about libraries. And they should be the epicenter of a campus. And I hope that as you sit here today, you recognize that we're doing all we can to improve that epicenter. And as you look out these windows, you reflect on what used to be here about a year ago. We had steam coming out of the ground and wrought iron fences that weren't straight and trees that were dead and kids kind of traversing any way they could. And we've created this new space that I think Bracelen would be very proud of. And as you look out these windows, the dorm behind me won't be there much longer. And we're going to create a new vista that will showcase what I believe one of the most beautiful buildings on campus, and that's the Weaver Building. And you take that and you combine it with the reading porch upstairs, and I believe we're well on our way to creating an environment that Lucy talked about. A place where kids can be creative, where they can talk to each other and collaborate and build these friendships and relationships that mean so much. You know, you talk about history, and I just returned last night from 2 weeks in Europe. We had the chance to kind of cross off on my bucket list some things I've always wanted to do with my wife and 3 other couples. But going to the war rooms in London, I'm reminded of a quote from Winston Churchill, who once said that history is nothing more than the biographies of great men and women. And Bracelen had this really unique ability to capture the stories of people, because people are what make up history. And if you'll indulge me for just 1 second, because I don't want to in any way diminish from what's been said today. And I think Lucy captured so brilliantly her dad's passion for history and his ability to go on site and learn about it and learn about the people. I had a chance to interview David McCullough when I was writing my dissertation, and he had just won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of my hero, Harry Truman. And he said, "Michael, I hope you're not going to do what most political scientists and historians do with their dissertations." And I said, "What's that?" He said, they suck the warm blood out of people. Well, that was kind of a graphic way to put it, but I said, Mr. McCall, I have no intention of all sucking any blood out of anybody. But he said they render people one-dimensional. And people are three-dimensional, and there's texture, and there's feeling, and there's predispositions that one has to take into account in writing history. And I think that's one thing that I really came to appreciate about the first book I read that Bracelen wrote. And I'll take you back to 2008, and I'll be very brief because I don't want to, again, distract from what's been said. I was in Lexington, Virginia, visiting my two older children who lived in a little town just next to Lexington called Buena Vista. And Buena Vista was named that for the cannonballs that they manufactured in the War of 1812 that led to the victory for the United States. And Buena Vista is about 7 miles from the campus of Washington Lee. And I'd never been there before, and I was so taken by the campus and the setting because right next to it is VMI, Virginia Military Institute, where another one of my heroes graduated, George Catlett Marshall. And there's a beautiful museum there about his life. And of course, he was the Secretary of State for President Truman. But I went to the chapel, and I went to the bookstore, and I picked up this book. And I came away after reading it with this enormous appreciation for Robert E. Lee. Now, I'm not from Alabama, Lee, but I did come to really, in a way that heretofore I had not had before, value his contributions after the war to the academy, to a campus that, as you know, was called Washington College. And after his death, the students, the faculty, and the staff so appreciated what he did that they renamed it Washington Lee. Well, I went back to find this book, and lo and behold, what did I find in here? It is a note from Charles Bracelen Flood, Kathy. But it's not to me, it's to my wife. And it is dated April the 13th, 2013. Well, you may say, well, what happened in April 2013? My wife and I had been here 10 days prior for my interview to be the president here. And I had my whole slate of meetings and interviews, and then Debbie had her set of meetings. And one of them was a luncheon with the Friends of the Library Board. And that night, after we were kind of decompressing and talking about our day, I said, well, how was your day? And she said, it was really fascinating. I said, what did you appreciate? What did you like? She said, well, there was this one man at lunch who had this really kind of regal-sounding name. And I said, well, who was he? And she said, I can't remember, but he gave me a book. And he'd given her, I think, Grant Sherman. And I picked it up. I said, are you kidding me? You had lunch with Charles Bracelen Flood. And she said, yeah, I did. I said, well, he wrote a book that changed my whole perspective on Robert E. Lee. So in this note that Bracelen wrote to my wife, Debbie, it's dated April the 13th. Dear Debbie, I very much enjoyed meeting you at the lunch at the EKU Library. Afterwards, I told you that you had my vote, and all of us liked you a lot. Well, Kathy, I looked throughout the note. There's nothing about me having his vote. But I am here today because of my wife, Debbie. I'm here because of Debbie, and just like he voted for the other deans, Bracelen approved of her, and we could not be more grateful. I want to say to the kids, to Lucy, and to Caperton, and to Curtis, that every day I have a reminder of your mom and your dad on my desk. I keep that candle right there next to my computer screen. And I received that at the memorial service for Bracelen just a few months ago, a year or so ago. And then I think of Kathy because I look out the window and I see Elmwood. So every day I have a reminder of two people who have profoundly impacted our community and our campus. And I want to thank them for their many contributions. I want to share just a brief story about this book and about a quote from Robert E. Lee relative to General Grant that I'm sure Lee will appreciate. I hope the rest of you will as well. In his book about General Lee, the story goes that he was once asked he and his family used to go to what was then called the White Sulphur Springs Resort, which later became the Greenbrier. And as it turns out, rumors started circulating that General Grant might be coming to that same resort. And if the two men came across each other, the inquiry was made to General Lee, well, what will you do? How will you respond? How will you react? And Lee said this, and this to me is the embodiment of what General Lee represented. He said this, "If General Grant comes, I shall welcome him to my home, show him all the courtesy that is due from one gentleman to another, and try to do everything in my power to make his stay here as agreeable as possible." Now, bear in mind, this is just a few months removed from Appomattox, and as the process unfolded as to what was going to happen to General Lee, because a lot of people in the United States did not know if he was going to be tried for treason, just like Jefferson Davis. It was in a setting like this that Lee was having a meeting with some faculty members at Washington College. And one faculty member saw this as a chance to kind of open up on his perspective on General Grant. And this is what happened. Lee's face flushed. For him, there was only the Grant of Appomattox, the man who had sent the officers of the Army of Northern Virginia home with their swords and pistols at their sides, the man who had released captured horses to be taken home to plow southern fields for desperately needed crop. "Sir," President Lee said to this faculty member, "if you ever again presume to speak disrespectfully of General Grant in my presence, either you or I will sever his connection with this university." And I'm sure he said it in that inimitable Virginia baritone. But that is, to me, represents the Lee that I fell in love with in this book. And that was Bracelen's ability. That was his gift, that you could take a person and make him three-dimensional, like Mr. McCullough talked about. In conclusion, let me just tell you one other thing that has to do with this book. Now, this is a borrowed copy because I loaned my copy to somebody else and I haven't gotten it back yet. As the folks here at EKU know, I have this fascination, somewhat recently developed, although I've admired them from afar for a while, of the Wright brothers. And when I'm asked to talk about a topic, I'll say, okay, enough about that. Let's get back to the Wright brothers. Yeah, they are, to me, endlessly fascinating. And as Betina shared with me, this is a review of The First to Fly that just appeared a few weeks ago in the Washington Times. And this particular review says at the end of the review, "The First to Fly is a perfect fit for the center of a trilogy of the beginning of aviation, with the Wright brothers by David McCullough providing the first powered flight in 1903, et cetera, et cetera." So there's this new, kind of renewed interest in what the Wright brothers meant to aviation. But had it not been for the French, when they were the first to express interest in what the Wright brothers were doing, when they hosted at Le Mans the examples of what the Wright aircraft could do, and then, of course, for the people that were captured in this book, who were willing to do what they did, I'm really amazed by that. In the very first chapter, Bracelen talks about this group of pilots that go to Ambassador Myron Herrick. Now, Myron Herrick was the governor of Ohio, and I thought about this quote from Wilbur Wright, who said, "If I were giving a young man advice as to how he might succeed in life, I would say to him, pick out a good father and a good mother and begin life in Ohio." The interesting connection here is that Ambassador Herrick went to Oberlin, and the only graduate of college from the Wright family was the daughter Catherine. And guess where she went to school? Oberlin. He then, in this particular passage, Bracelen talks about how these pilots prevail upon the ambassador to, in effect, give his blessing to their signing up. And he says this: "Their influence upon sentiment at home was also tremendous," speaking of the pilots who volunteered. "Here were Americans shedding their blood for a cause in which America's heart was also engaged and to which later she pledged the lives of her sons. I suppose that without them we would doubtless have entered the war. But the shout they sent up as they left my office was answered by millions of passionate voices, urging the authorities of their government to act. Nothing is more just than that these first defenders of our country's good name should be singled out for special love and reverenced by ourselves, just as they have been by the French. To put kind of a final postscript on it, I saw this firsthand as we went to the beaches of Normandy. We went to Omaha and Utah and Sword and Gold and saw how much reverence the French have for what the Americans did. And maybe you don't sense that in other places of the world, but to see our stars and stripes flying right alongside French flags really says a great deal about what people did in the last century in defense of all that was good and just, and it started with these pilots. And the fact that Bracelen was able to capture that and relay it in a way that is, to us, in many ways, a news story. I didn't know about it, but now I do. And I'm so grateful for Bracelen for his life, and may God bless his memory. And thank you very much for being here today.
So all of you know he was a special man. And today we dedicate this space to him for what we envision this space to be. This space was designed for the interaction between human beings. And Lucy, I'm so glad that you said some of what you said, because that's why we're doing this here today. Our idea is that students and other people will find their way here and find each other while they are pursuing ideas and inspiration, learning and meaning. And as you look around, you see booths, seating, you see small rooms for collaboration, tables and chairs that move and roll so that individuals can move to each other. This space is right for this dedication because from our experience with Bracelen, and as fans you know this from his writing, we know that he loved the connection from one human being to another. Human beings fascinated him, and their stories fascinated him, right, Lucy? What it means to be a human being fascinated him. Time and again, he asked me to find ways for our students who looked lonely to connect with one another. He sat in Java City Cafe and he watched them. He worried about them. And believe it or not, he and I talked about many of the features you see in this space today as possible ways to get people together, to meet each other, and for conversation. He observed people. That's what he did. That's what writers do. And I know that he would watch me. There are times when I rush around, and those of you who know me, I'm caught up in some panic or another, not very aware of the fact that I'm a human being at all. And he would stop me. He would say, "Slow down, Betina, let's have a cup of coffee." And so that, I don't know how many of you know this, but he loved YouTube. He loved YouTube. And so he would say, "Let's have a cup of coffee. And did you know Audrey Hepburn was a trained ballerina? Let's pull up a clip of Audrey Hepburn and watch her dance." Or let's watch the Scottish National Pipe and Drum Corps play Scotland the Brave. Do you know how many times Bracelen and I, on a rainy day, sat with coffee and listened to Scotland the Brave? Many times. And I will confess that he and I got weepy. He told me, he said, "I wish I'd met you when I was younger because you would see that I had red hair and freckles like you, similar to you." So we shared, that special call of the bagpipe. He would tell me a wonderful story about Kathy. He loved Kathy. Oh my goodness, he had a reverence for Kathy. And one of their adventures, he would show me a picture of these gorgeous grandchildren with their incredible eyeballs. They're beautiful, just beautiful children. And he would talk, and I'm sorry, Caperton and Curtis, but he would talk about Lucy like she was an angel from heaven. His darling Lucy. You boys know this, right? He would tell me stories about his jaunts around the world as a journalist with the Associated Press, and I just stood in awe because I love a good story. Many of us, I think, would say that Bracelen could not live without beauty and grace in his life daily, and he would slow us all down to make note of it. He never failed to mention us in the libraries. From those of us who helped him with a hot cup of coffee, to Pat New and Interlibrary Loan, or the rest of her team, someone in reference who helped him track down some really, really obscure citations. He all made us feel special by acknowledging us in his books. My connection to him is one that many people here in the libraries, especially that group he called the Lunch Bunch, enjoyed. The Lunch Bunch is a group of staff who gathered most days for lunch, and we shared details of our lives. And Lucy knows this because she spoke of it. And we all had very, very different lives, but we all connected to Bracelen in some way. And I want to note that in this year, we lost a precious member of the bunch, Eric Hall, who was killed in a tragic automobile accident in Nashville this summer. Bracelen and Eric shared very little in common: a Harvard man and a Harlan man. Eric loved old country music. He loved Loretta Lynn and Dolly Parton. But they were both staunch old school Republicans. And I miss so much the picture of them walking in and hearing them. Eric would have his Western shirt on and his leather jacket and pointy shoes, and Bracelen in his East Coast cashmere sweater with a pop of color that Leah Banks insisted he have, and his khakis, and they would be just going on one of their talks, and I can still hear Eric say, "You got that right, Bracelen." I cannot tell you how much this library loved the both of them. In the same review that President Benson referenced, the reviewer noted of Bracelen's last book, First to Fly, quote, "The book is not centered on the aircraft, but rather the personnel, men, women, soldiers in the trenches, in hospitals, in Paris on leave," end quote. Similarly, today we focus less on his books, or I have, but more on the man who meant so much to us. Today, we are dedicating the space to a person, a human being who became a part of our EKU family. So yes, this space is a perfect homage to Bracelen. It will draw together friends. It will excite thinkers. It will encourage conversation. Friends will laugh with each other and learn from each other. People will agree and disagree and love to learn the human condition in all of its messy glory, and that is the perfect dedication to our friend, Charles Bracelen Flood. Our small plaque over here on the table is a poignant reminder that our libraries experienced something very special in our friendship with Mr. Flood, and we will never, ever forget him, and we want to ensure that those who replace us don't either. Thank you so much for coming today to honor such a glorious and generous spirit.